I'd like to thank the Soho Forum, the Dartmouth Political Union, Gene, and everyone else for coming. Thank you so much. And I want to echo Scott's remarks that today I am coming from a place of respect for Scott's work. We disagree vehemently, but this is not a debate for personal attacks and ad hominem. So I'd like to start my argument by quoting Vladimir Putin. On the eve of the war, the second war against Ukraine that he launched on February 21st, 2022, this is a quote from his speech. Quote, "Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. So I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia," end quote. So let's leave aside the fake history here. The Bolsheviks opposed Ukrainian independence and only agreed to the federation of Ukraine into the USSR after Vladimir Lenin's policies to outlaw the Ukrainian language and snuff out Ukrainian nationalism had failed. But I want to ask the audience, does that sound like a man who was backed into a corner? Does it sound like a man who has exhausted all of his options, who's trying war only as a last resort? Or let's consider the Russian propaganda campaign itself. Before the war, the second war that Putin started, he insisted, for example, that Kyiv was under the thumb of a Nazi regime, which is a nonsense babbling assertion about a government led by the country's first Jewish president. Or consider the first actions of the Russian army in the 2022 campaign. Did they seek to create, say, a buffer zone out of the range of artillery that Ukraine itself was not even firing into Russian territory? No. Vladimir Putin sent a team of commandos into Kyiv to find Zelensky and to kill him. Did Putin negotiate in good faith with Ukraine or President Joe Biden, who many times sought to call this off? No, he did not. So again, I ask, does this sound like a man provoked? Does it sound like somebody who is only responding to 3 decades of American statecraft to invade his country's neighbor? Of course it is not. Because the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, much like Putin's invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, was not defensive. These are wars of conquest. Vladimir Putin believes he is correcting a historical error. The Ukrainian people, with its unique language, its unique history, its unique culture, and its democratic aspirations, are to Russia's leader entirely a fiction. This was a war to extinguish Ukraine. Now, I am focusing on Vladimir Putin because he's really the only decider in Russia today. And I will not pay him the undue respect of conflating his wishes with those of the Russian people. We know that Putin rules as a tyrant based on this latest war, but so much more. This momentous decision for Russia that has brought misery, or at least economic misery, and global censure to Russia, was not made in consultation with the Russian people or even the Russian Duma. Even when columns of tanks were rolling towards Kyiv at the beginning of this war, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations insisted that they were not, because he didn't know. No one except for Putin and a very small insular circle of advisors really rules Russia today. And he decided to plunge this country into war, a war that has cost the Russians dearly, not to mention the Ukrainians, with no mandate or anything resembling a democratic process. And once this war was started, once the war that Putin started, he decreed that no Russian may criticize it. Contrary to Russian propaganda, Ukrainians do not want to be dominated by Russia. In December of 1991, they made this abundantly clear when 85% of the country showed up to vote on the matter, and 92%, including majorities in the provinces that border Russia, voted for independence. And as his country reeled from economic collapse and a military that was broken by Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, the first post-Soviet leader, Boris Yeltsin, recognized the independence of this former Soviet republic, along with the rest of them. And just as Yeltsin reluctantly accepted the initial expansion of NATO. Now, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I believe the disintegration of the Soviet Empire was one of the greatest moments of the 20th century. This was a regime that disappeared intellectuals and dissidents and forced them to work as slaves in gulags, that poisoned and murdered its critics abroad. This was a regime that turned Ukraine, the breadbasket of the empire, into a wasteland, deliberately starving millions of its citizens between 1932 and 1933 in what we know today as the Holodomor. But not everyone agrees with me on this. Vladimir Putin has called the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has spent nearly 20 years trying to reconstitute that empire, if not its discredited economic system. That is what explains the Cold War today between America and Russia. Putin is not responding to a real threat. He is clinging to the nightmare of a lost empire. And until fairly recently, we should say that Russia was actually pretty stealthy in its efforts to exert dominion over the former republics of the Soviet Union. Until its invasion of Georgia in 2008, Russia outsourced its dirty work to its intelligence services. Here I want to read briefly from a 2007 cable from U.S. Ambassador to Georgia John Teft. It was released in 2010 by WikiLeaks. Quote, while the Russians typically make some effort to reduce their fingerprints on actions, making it hard to say with 100% certainty that they are responsible for many of them, the cumulative weight of evidence of the last few years suggests that the Russians are aggressively playing a high-stakes, covert game, and they consider few, if any, holds barred. Now, I should say that is written in 2007. That is a year before Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia. And that high-stakes covert game included such things as firing ground-based missiles at the headquarters of the pro-Georgian government in exile of Abkhazia, a breakaway province, a bombing of a police station in Gori, and the sabotage and bombing of natural gas pipelines in North Ossetia. All of these direct actions, as they are known by Russia's GRU, preceded that open invasion in 2008. In 2007, Russia also conducted a massive cyber attack against Estonia for having the temerity to remove a Soviet-era bronze statue of an unknown soldier. In Belarus, more recently, after Alexander Lukashenko stole the presidential election, Putin shored up his regime as it conducted mass arrests. In exchange, Belarus has allowed Putin to use his country as a staging ground for its war on Ukraine. Even in 2014, when it was obvious that Russia had invaded Crimea and the Donbass, Putin still denied that his forces were involved until much later. Now, we should notice a theme in all of this. Vladimir Putin is absolutely terrified that any former Soviet republics might seek an open society for themselves. We know this for a few reasons. Russian propaganda has labeled every grassroots democratic movement a Western provocation. Doesn't matter whether this was the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. Anytime citizens organize themselves against an autocrat or protest a stolen election, the Kremlin will claim it's really the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, the State Department, or some other NGO. The Russian Foreign Ministry's 2023 concept paper, which is the kind of equivalent of its statement of official policy, comes close to making all of this explicit. In the section on Russia's near abroad, which is a euphemism for the former republics, it says that Russia's goal is, quote, establishing an integrated economic and political space in Eurasia in the long term. And that is nothing wrong with that. Fair enough. One would expect it. But the section then goes on to emphasize its Russian policy to prevent and counter, quote, unfriendly actions of foreign states and their alliances which provoke disintegration processes in the near abroad and create obstacles to the exercise of the sovereign right of Russia's allies and partners to deepen their comprehensive cooperation with Russia. In other words, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus are free to make their own decisions so long as they decide to embrace comprehensive cooperation with Russia. Now, this conceit that the former republics are free to make their own decisions only if they choose correctly helps explain Putin's rewriting of recent history when it comes to the Maidan revolution in Kyiv, or the Revolution of Dignity. To understand this full story, it's really important here to get into the weeds, talk a little bit about the man who fled his own country for Russia at the end of February 2014. His name is Viktor Yanukovych. He came from the east of Ukraine, an industrial base that historically was closer to Russia then Kyiv and the Ukraine's western provinces. Yanukovych was president during the Orange Revolution, when protesters flooded Kyiv to protest what they saw as the stolen election. Yanukovych agreed to a runoff, and then he lost that election. He ran again in 2010, and he did win legitimately. And after he won, he did a number of favors for Moscow. He officially declared, for example, that Ukraine would no longer seek membership in NATO, a process that was always doomed to fail. We can get into that in the back and forth. But one that is used, at least as by Russia, this membership into NATO, and its defenders as a pretext for the current war. He also agreed, by the way, to a long-term lease for Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Nonetheless, Yanukovych and his party of regents campaigned on the promise of Ukraine joining the European Common Market, the EU. And at the moment, when the entire 5-year negotiations was about to conclude in 2013, Vladimir Putin demanded that Ukraine's president pull away from the deal. And Yanukovych acknowledged, by the way, as much of this on state television at the time. And the sudden reversal, the president's caving to a hostile neighbor, enraged millions of Ukrainians who took to the streets in protest, most notably at the capital in Maidan Square. Now, according to the Kremlin, this was all astroturf. But there's no evidence to support the claim that were it not for some training from the NED, none of this would have happened. Ask yourself, who's really interfering here in the sovereignty of Ukraine? Is it the National Endowment for Democracy, or is it Vladimir Putin? So, I ask all of this because the story that Putin tells of 2014 is that the protesters at Maidan, in fact, were the aggressors. But no one, and I mean no one, should believe this. It's true that 13 police officers and security officers were killed in these clashes between November 2013 and February 2014. Compare that to 100 protesters that were killed by these security forces. And then consider that the bulk of those protesters, 78 of them, were killed between February 17th and February 20th. And that's a very important time, because that is the same period where you saw Poland, United States, and France trying to negotiate a way out of the standoff. Now, the interior minister at the time, someone by the name of Vitaly Zakharenko, I might be mispronouncing that, was being advised by the Russian operatives, and it was his forces that escalated the conflict. And then suddenly, they vanished. And it was, again, a shock to everyone. Yanukovych fled Russia, and Ukraine's parliament voted to then strip him of his office. I should note that Zakharenko also fled eventually to Moscow and was rewarded with a job as a senior advisor to the Russian state-owned military tech concern known as Rostek. Now, we all know what happened after that. Putin sent his little green men into Crimea and his GRU advisors into the Donbass. He couldn't coerce Ukraine's president to join his economic union, so he decided to make war until he got what he wanted. Does that sound like someone who was provoked by U.S. foreign policy? To explain this war of conquest as a reaction to the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization gets it precisely backwards. The expansion of NATO was driven by the present fears of former captive nations who knew Soviet domination firsthand. Former dissidents like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel, who could go on to lead Poland and the Czech Republic, said this explicitly in the 1990s as NATO expanded. They feared that one day Russia would seek to reconstitute the empire it lost in 1991, and it's a testament to the strength of NATO that Poland and the Czech Republic have survived as independent states as Ukraine fights for its life. Havel and Walesa were right. But as libertarians and all people of conscience should also understand, Putin's real enemies are not Western NGOs or the US government or even NATO. It is his own people. His real fear is that his own citizens will see Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians one day thriving and living in democratic societies, and that his own population will ask why they must live under the thumb of a tyrant when their neighbors do not.